start out, fascism. Fascism is a term that gets thrown out quite a bit. It's a favorite term of the synthetic left. And they call Trump supporters fascists. They call anyone who disagrees with them fascists. But fascism actually does have a real meaning. And I was actually impressed to see Tulsi Gabbard on Fox News kind of get it. Not exactly, but kind of get it. This is Tulsi Gabbard. She recently appeared on Fox News, and she was talking about Biden-omics. This is what she said. Take a listen to this.
There's been a noticeable shift in the media's focus to really not run away from the economy, but to try to spin this economy as something much different than it actually is in the real life of most Americans.
Yeah, Laura, it sounds like from some of the conversations you've been having with people there in Minneapolis, they get what all of these spin doctors don't. They actually see what's happening, which is, quote unquote, Biden-omics are failing the American people. But what people in Washington are not focusing on enough is what actually is Biden-omics. Biden-omics essentially is fascism, a kind of national socialism where we have government bureaucrats and politicians partnering and colluding with these massive corporations and the ultra rich to make these business deals, picking winners and losers that serve their own self-interest and the interests of the power elite at the cost of the well-being of the American people, not only today, but in the increasing debt that they are incurring that will affect us for generations to come. And foremost, the perfect example of this, Laura, you and I have talked about this before, is the military-industrial complex. They have essentially a blank check, unaccounted amount of spending of taxpayer dollars. And if you or I or anyone else says, hey, is all that you're spending actually strengthening our national security? Is it serving the best interest of the American people? And maybe perhaps we should know where every dollar is being spent. If we say that, we are at risk of being called unpatriotic. I've been called that before for asking these very questions. And so people aren't even allowed to challenge or question where this spending is going and how it's benefiting the American people, what to speak of our economy and everyday Americans being able to, frankly, survive and live comfortably, what to speak of prosper in the United States of America.
Now, Biden wants us all, I think, Tulsi, to kind of clap like seals since year-over-year inflation isn't as high as it was last year. But since he's taken office, consumer prices have gone up nearly 16%. We obviously know what's happened with energy costs. Now, this is something that is really hitting the middle class, the lower middle class, really, really hard. The elites are kind of gliding above it, as they usually do.
And that's exactly what we're seeing as President Biden and his administration and the elites are celebrating, quote unquote, Biden-omics. The American people know better because those successes that are being touted are actually the opposite is being felt. And again, this is where we have to hold the Biden administration, the Democrat elite, accountable. This is not about, well, we just have to message things better. That's always their answer, rather than actually looking at what the problem is, because doing that would require them to look in the mirror.
So that was very important, what Tulsi Gabbard just said there. And she was very, very correct. And it's very difficult when you're going on regular 24/7 cable news. It's very difficult to talk about these complicated concepts. She said a lot very quickly. But the first thing that's important, I think, about what you just saw there, she's talking about Biden and Biden economics. She doesn't call him a communist. Let me repeat that. She does not call him a communist, which is standard on Fox News. In conservative spaces, be it Tucker Carlson, be it Donald Trump and his rhetoric, they generally refer to Joe Biden and the woke left as socialists or communists. She didn't do that. She called them fascists. She said Bidenomics is fascism. And she pointed out that fascism is an economic system. Fascism isn't people saying nasty words. Fascism isn't, a synonym for racism. Rather, she did say that fascism is rooted in economics. And I see your super chat, your tip, Daniel J. And I'm putting it down. I'm cutting and pasting it. The Russia summit looks like an anti-imperialist summit. So I'm putting that on the list. Thank you, Daniel J. On Rockfin. We got our first super chat for the second half of our show, and thank you very much. So the other thing that's important is she mentions the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex is fascist by definition. Hollimer Schacht, the economist of Nazi Germany, created the world's first military-industrial complex. He set up, a special bank that facilitated military spending and military loans, and they rebooted the German economy by pulling out of the Versailles Treaty and rearming the country. So this is all very important. And again, she doesn't have time to explain huge concepts, and I don't think she necessarily knows everything that she's getting at on there, right? But she doesn't know how right she is. Let me just put it that way. She did use some of the rhetoric that we use in this book, Where is America Going? She does use some of the rhetoric that we use. And in this book, Where is America Going? I talk a lot about what fascism actually means. And in this book, I go into great detail about what fascism actually means and why Biden-omics, if you want to call it that, is fascism, and how it does involve the government setting up bureaucracy to rig things in favor of the ultra-rich and hurt the economy overall. So she's right. She's right. But in order to understand how she's right, you have to understand aspects of Marxism and capitalism that are very important. So I guess I'll just quickly, when she says it's fascism, let me just put that on here, right? Because I want you to see this again.
National socialism, where we have government and doctors don't. They actually see what's happening, which is, quote unquote, Bidenomics are failing the American people. But what people in Washington are not focusing on enough,
here we go,
is what actually is Bidenomics. Bidenomics essentially is fascism, a kind of national socialism where we have government bureaucrats and politicians partnering and colluding with these massive corporations and the ultra rich to make these.
The ultra rich, right? She didn't say the rich. She said the ultra rich. And I've talked about this division in the ruling class.
Business deals, picking winners and losers that serve their own self-interest and the interests of the power elite at the cost of the well-being of the American people, not only today, but in the increasing debt that they are incurring that will affect us for generations to come. And foremost, the perfect example of this, Laura, you and I've talked about this before, is the military-industrial complex. They have essentially a blank check, unaccounted amount of spending of taxpayer dollars. And if you or I or anyone else says, hey, is all that you're spending actually strengthening our national security? Is it serving the best interest of the American people? And maybe perhaps we should know where every dollar is being spent. If we say that, we are at risk of being called unpatriotic.
Yeah, she gets it. She gets it. We've seen her pick up talking points from our community before. We've seen that she used some of the analysis in the Kamala Harris book. And I think, you can hear some of our rhetoric in what she's saying about the ultra rich, not just the rich. You can hear some of our rhetoric. And, I guess, I think I have the clip here, right? Apparently, according to Trevor Loudon, we are an influence on her. According to Trevor Loudon, do I have that clip here? I loved that clip when Trevor Loudon said that we were an influence on her. He said that on the podcast of Roger Stone. That was utterly beautiful when he says that. Do I have that clip here? Do I have that clip? I don't think I have that clip. I don't have that clip here, but yeah, that was a great clip. Let me see. I can pull that one up for us. Let's put that on just to put that clip in context, right? Just to put that clip in context. We'll show what CPI is credited. It's credited for. We'll put that clip on, and then we'll get into the meat of this. We want to get into the meat of this because there's a lot there. There's a lot there. So here we go. We'll show what was said. This was said on Roger Stone's podcast. This is a clip from an episode of Roger Stone's podcast last August. And this is what was said, right? This is a very important pro-Trump podcast. Had a guy who writes for Epoch Times. This is what he said.
There to promote Russian and North Korean foreign policies. She may not understand that, but she's being used by people like Dennis Kucinich and others to do that. She also has some connections to the Center for Political Innovation, which is a very pro-Russian outfit run by a man called Caleb Maupin, who used to be in the Workers' World Party. She's on the...
Did you hear that?
Has some connections to the Center for Political Innovation, which is a very pro-Russian outfit run by a man called Caleb Maupin, who used to be in the Workers' World Party. She's on the...
Now, that was a shocker to all of us when we saw it. I didn't even know about it. I don't watch Roger Stone's podcast. But when that came out, that was last August that was said. That was a big shocker to all of us. But then, since then, she has dropped little hints. I mean, she more or less quoted the thesis and the outlook of my Kamala Harris book in her interview with Jordan Peterson. Now she's talking about how Biden-omics is fascism, and it's working for the ultra-rich, and that the military-industrial complex is a big aspect of fascism. And she's straying from the standard conservative argument. Standard conservative Fox News arguments are that basically that Biden's a communist, Biden's a leftist, the only way to be a pure good American conservative, is to be a libertarian. That's not what Tulsi Gabbard is saying. So I want to talk about why Biden-omics is fascism. I want to talk about why that is and what fascism really is. And these concepts are not simple, okay? These concepts are complicated. But that's why you all are here, right? We're here to take things to another level, right? If you just wanted sound bites, you'd turn on cable television. But you're watching me as I sit here late on Friday evening on my lovely Brooklyn apartment. I sit here and explain all of this to you. So before we can explain why Bidenomics is fascism, we have to explain why capitalism has broken down and why capitalism frequently breaks down. So we have to explain what's called the problem of overproduction, right? And this is important. These concepts are important, right? I've repeated them a lot, but they are extremely important. All right. Under capitalism, production is carried out for profit, right? A capitalist doesn't make products because he feels like it. He makes it to make a profit. In capitalism, you don't have food so people can eat it. You have food so big box stores and agribusiness can make money off of it. In capitalism, you don't have housing so people can live in it. You have housing so landlords and banks and other corporations can make money off of it, right? Capitalism is production organized for profit. And in the capitalist mode of production, you have this inherent problem, right? If you are a capitalist and you're going to make a product, you're going to need materials to make that product. So that's A. That'll be the cost of your materials. You're also going to need to ship the product, to transport the product to wherever it's being sold. So that's B. All right. Now, you can't change these costs. These are what's called fixed capital. You cannot change how much the shipping costs. It costs a certain amount. You cannot change how much the materials cost. It costs a certain amount. In addition to that, though, you're going to have your labor cost, the cost of hiring workers to assemble the product. So that's C. That's your labor cost. And all of this will add up to the total cost of the product, which is D. A plus B plus C equals D. However, there's a bit of a problem there, isn't there? The problem is the capitalist has to make a profit. And D represents the final cost of the product. And A, the shipping, that can't change. That's fixed. That's set. B, the materials, can't change. That's set. So the profit that the capitalist takes out of every product is extracted from the value put into it by the worker. So you divide C1 and C2. C1 is what the worker actually gets paid out of the value that the worker puts into the product. And C2 is the profit that the capitalist extracts from the product. Right? The only way the capitalist can extract profit from each product is by cutting into the value created by the worker. And this is the problem of surplus value, right? This is the basis on which Marxists argue capitalists exploit workers, right? Because the value that workers put into each product is cut into by the capitalist in order to make his profits. However, and many people look at this, they say, well, this is wrong, right? That the worker is not getting the full value that he puts into every product. But then the capitalist looks at this and says, well, yeah, but the employer, he put up the money, he had the idea for the corporation, he's providing employment, he's risking. And that becomes an argument, right? The Marxist says this is immoral, this is exploitation, the worker's not getting the full value of his labor. The capitalist says, well, I put up the money, I'm taking the risk. And this becomes kind of a back and forth. Well, that's all a distraction. That's all a distraction. Because the actual problem with this is not simply that it's unfair, right? And we have an argument about whether this is unfair or not. The problem is this. C1 is less than D. The wages paid out in the process of production are never enough to purchase the products that are produced. In the process of hiring workers to make stuff, there's always more stuff created than there are wages paid out to the worker. The worker is also the consumer. And the wages paid out to the worker are never enough for the worker to purchase the products that he has created. And this is the basis of the boom-bust cycle in capitalism. And it's always there, right? The capitalists are always trying to deal with this, right? That you have what's called glut, where there's all kinds of products being produced and they cannot be purchased. And there's many examples of glut. In Missouri, there's a cave where the U.S. government has purchased billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese and buried it. Why? To keep the price of dairy high enough that farmers don't go out of business, right? There's many examples of this. The government purchases oranges by the bunch and buries them or dumps them into the ocean. They pay farmers not to produce food. This is a really common one. Farmers get a stipend from the government for not using all the land that they own and not producing food in order that you don't have a glut in the farmer and the food market, right? To inflate the price of food. This is a constant problem in capitalism. The worker is never paid enough to buy back the product that he produces. There's always more products being created than there are wages paid out to the worker to purchase the products. This is an inherent problem of capitalism. G-L-U-T, glut. It's just built into the capitalist system. You have this problem. However, and this is the important thing, when there's a big technological leap, this problem becomes greatly intensified. What the capitalist is constantly trying to do is reduce labor costs. He can't change the cost of the shipping. He can't change the cost of the materials. But the less labor costs that he pays, the higher his profits can be. Right? He pays less for workers. He reduces the role of the worker in production. He replaces the worker with a machine. He replaces the worker with machines. He makes the worker easier to replace, less training. He de-skills the job. He ships the product overseas to somewhere where he can pay somebody 2 cents an hour to make it rather than paying the minimum wage in the United States. The capitalist is constantly trying to reduce the payout, C1, that he pays to the worker. And technological leaps are the primary way he does it, right? He eliminates labor with machines. But when C decreases, C2 also decreases because the profit of the capitalist comes from the labor. He can't cut in to the value created by the supplies. He can't cut into the value created by the shipping. He can only cut into human labor to extract his profits. And because the capitalist reduces, in order to make production more efficient, he constantly reduces the amount of human labor that goes into every product. He reduces the rate of profit that he makes on every product. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit, or the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And that is why, under the capitalist system, when you have a huge technological leap, it leads to the problem of overproduction and the problem of glut being higher than ever. If the rate of profit that the capitalist makes on each product goes down, the capitalist is forced to churn out even more products to make the same amount of profit because the rate of profit has gone down. And that when you have a big technological leap in capitalism, this leads to a long-term economic crisis. Now, in the early period of capitalism, the early years of industrial capitalism, the so-called Gilded Age that libertarians like to talk about, there was a crisis or a glut on the market, a problem of overproduction, a panic on the stock exchange every couple years. Every 1 or 2 years, the economy would completely melt down. The Federal Reserve Bank was eventually created by J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan had a meeting on Jekyll Island with a lot of other bankers and wealthy people, and they developed the Federal Reserve System as a mechanism for dealing with this ongoing problem of the capitalist system, right? This ongoing problem, right? Someone's referencing the coal miner's paradox, the coal miner's riddle, right? The story goes, the little boy says to his father, "Father, why is it so cold?" And the father says, because of the fact that we can't afford any coal to heat our home. The little boy says to the father, "Why can't we afford any coal to heat our home?" And the father says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine. I've been laid off." The little boy says to his father, "Why have you been laid off? Why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" He says, "Because there is too much coal." That's overproduction. That's glut. That's the built-in problem of capitalism, poverty created by abundance. And it's always there. And it used to lead to an economic meltdown every couple years. The Gilded Age of industrial capitalism involved a meltdown like this every couple years. However, the problem, this built-in problem of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profit, it was something that the capitalists developed various methods to deal with. And you had, antitrust legislation. You had the Federal Reserve Bank. However, it still couldn't get over this inherent problem. In the lead up to World War I, you started to have great technological leaps, right? In the early parts of the 20th century, they were, doing pretty amazing things in terms of radios and electric lights, et cetera. And this all set the stage for World War I. World War I was a horrendous episode of mass death and killing. And what was happening was there was a big problem of overproduction. The market was glutted with products that couldn't be sold, and the Western capitalist countries, they needed to dump their excess products on captive markets. Imperialism is when these big corporations, the Western capitalist countries, seize parts of the developing world and use them as captive markets to dump their excess products on. When the British went to India, they burned all their looms and they forced them to import their cloth from British textile companies, right? Great example is, when they talk about what Bill Clinton did with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Mexico had been growing its own food for thousands of years, since before Christopher Columbus ever showed up. But because of NAFTA, Bill Clinton went in there, and now we dump our excess food onto Mexico. American agribusiness has put all the Mexican farmers out of business. And as a result, American farm and agribusiness dumps its excess products onto Mexico. And that the imperialist powers, France, Britain, Germany, the United States, were fighting with each other over the colonized world. Germany wanted a bigger chunk of Africa and a bigger chunk of Asia for itself. And it was fighting with the French and it was fighting with the British over the control of Africa and over the control of Asia and over the domination of the Chinese market and over Latin America and South America, right? And that the imperialism as an economic system developed out of the need to dump excess products and to have captive markets, to go to the developing world, to destroy their economy and force them to buy the products that you can't sell at home because of the problem of overproduction. And the problem of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profits drives imperialism. The imperialists constantly need more and more people to buy their products. They need to eliminate competitors from the market. They need people to buy their products. And this is the problem of imperialism. Imperialism is about holding back economic development. It's about seizing parts of the world as captive markets. And the imperialist powers battle each other for control over the world markets. World War I, you'll recall, was a big confrontation. The German imperialists and the Austrian imperialists battled against the American imperialists, the British imperialists, and the French imperialists, and they lost. And Germany was stripped of its colonies. And the British and the American and the French imperialists had the upper hand. And all of Europe, pretty much, the European mainland was razed to the ground. 20 million working class people were sent to their deaths. It was an orgy of mass death and killing like humanity had never seen. Poison gas and chemical weapons were used, machine guns. World War I was an utter nightmare. And it ate up human lives and it destroyed property and it rebooted the global economy. And after World War I, you saw the roaring 20s. The 1920s, the economy of the world started to pick up and it started to advance. You had the roaring 20s. Now, Germany was completely destroyed. And on top of being destroyed and losing its industrial base, Germany had to pay reparations to France and Britain and the United States for the war. It was punished and forced to pay reparations. So Germany wasn't back on its feet. But Britain and America were back on their feet. And the United States had the luxury of not having the fighting happen on American soil. And so the United States was selling products to the rest of the world, and it was the parts of the world that had been under German domination were now under American domination, and the U.S. economy did pretty well in the 1920s. In the 1920s, there was a guy named Henry Ford. Ever heard of Henry Ford? Henry Ford was an industrialist, a great pioneer of the American automobile industry. And Henry Ford developed very efficient ways of producing products. And he followed Taylorism. He closely managed the lives of his workers, would fire them if they had extramarital affairs, was paying them more than most factory workers got paid. They tended to get higher wages, but they were managed, and he studied how to make these workers very efficient on the assembly line. And Henry Ford, and, there was a guy named Taylor who was an expert in industrial efficiency. Henry Ford engineered assembly line production to be much more efficient. There were huge leaps in assembly line production. And during the 1920s, people would say that Ford has defeated Karl Marx. Henry Ford has defeated Karl Marx because they argued that Henry Ford had invented a new kind of very efficient, very advanced, productive capitalism that didn't have the problem of overproduction. Ford has defeated Marx. Ford has overtaken Marx. That was the slogan that was widely used during the 1920s. But then we know what happened, right? 1929, the stock market crashed, and all of this efficiency that had led to a boom in the 1920s led to a prolonged economic crisis called the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was because of this same problem. Because under capitalism, technological advances lead to greater poverty. The role of the worker at the assembly line is reduced. The more wealth that's created, the poorer people get. Poverty created by abundance. This is the problem of capitalism. So this is where fascism comes in. Right? You have to understand this in order to understand fascism. And nobody understands this. This is basic. This is Marxism 101. This is in the Communist Manifesto. This is in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by Frederick Engels. This issue of poverty created by abundance, people being homeless because there are too many houses, people being hungry because there is too much food, right? The coal miner's riddle that I recited for you before, poverty created by abundance, glut. This problem is inherent to the Marxist understanding of capitalism, but nobody talks about it. It's just something that's just off limits. None of the bread tubers know what it is. They think overproduction means you make too much stuff. They don't understand this problem. No, the problem is the worker cannot buy back what he creates. Yeah, the problem is the reduction of the worker in production, the tendency of the falling rate of profits. None of them will ever talk about any of this, even though this is intrinsic. This is essential to understanding Marxism, right? Marxism doesn't just say greed is bad. Marxism doesn't just say greedy capitalists don't care about their workers. It has a scientific understanding of how, under capitalism, poverty is created by abundance. The more wealth that is created, the greater technology advances, the poorer everyone gets. This is Marxism. So when you have this problem, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with this problem? Well, let me take you back to Britain. In, I believe it was like the 1790s in Britain, in the aftermath of the French Revolution, there was a guy named Robert Malthus. And Robert Malthus was an economist in Britain, and he argued that the problem of the French Revolution, this mass episode of unrest that had overthrown feudalism in France, was caused by a term he invented called overpopulation. That he said that the food supply had not kept up with the population, and that the French people, there were too many of them, and the food supply hadn't kept up with them. And so as a result of that, you had a mass episode of unrest. And that the problem of capitalism, this problem of overproduction, the tendency of the falling rate of profit, wasn't the problem. The problem was that there are just too many people in the world. This concept of overpopulation. And this is called Malthusianism, the notion that there are just too many people in the world. Overpopulation. And it's bullshit. And why is it bullshit? Because human labor creates all wealth. So if you have more people, those people can go out and create more wealth. Human beings are the source of all the wealth of the world. Human beings are productive laborers. And this idea that, human beings are non-productive consumers, that's not accurate. Human beings are the source of all wealth. So if you have more people, those people can go out and create more wealth. It's not a rational thing, right? The more people you have, the more wealth you can produce because human labor produces wealth. So it's a bullshit concept. Malthusianism, overpopulation. And that, he was saying this, Robert Malthus was talking about overpopulation at a time that the human population was so much smaller. What was the human population at the time that Malthus wrote what he wrote? Human population in 1790. What was it? right? The world population in 1790. What was the world population in 1790? Population of the world. I'm just pulling it up. 1790. What was it? What was it? Trying to find it. Wow, you'd think it'd be easier to find these kinds of things. The global population. I'm seeing a global population map. Right. So the global population, right? Around that time, it would have been population in millions. So it would have been around 1750. It was less than 2 billion people in the world. There would have been less than 2 billion people in the world at that point. And they were talking about overpopulation, right? Which is, I mean, right? It would have been a lot less than 2 billion people. Why is this so hard to find, right? World population by year. Let's talk about the rise in the world population, right? World population by year, but how far does it go back, right? Seeing it by the 90s. Oh, here we go. All right. So the world population in 1760 was less than a billion. It was 770 million people, right? So it was less than a billion at that point. And he was talking about overpopulation. Now we have 6 billion people in the world. So his notion that, the global economy just can't handle so many people, it's false, because the more people we get, those people then go out and produce more wealth. It's bad economics. And Karl Marx, in his book Theories of Surplus Value, he goes into great detail about this. The representing people is what Malthus referred to as unproductive consumers. This isn't rational. However, in the capitalist system, where the role of the worker in production is constantly going down, there's less and less room for the worker at the assembly line. The capitalist system has less and less of a role for the worker in production. So the problem is capitalism. The problem is the worker doesn't have a role in production. The capitalist has no use for the worker at the assembly line. That's the problem. But Malthus said the problem was overpopulation. Now, fascist economics, as we understood from Hjalmar Schacht, who was the main economist of Nazi Germany, fascist economics was an attempt to stabilize capitalism with degrowth methods. That is the essence of fascist economics. And I go into great detail about it in my book, right? And one of the sources on this is none other than Lothrop Stoddard. Do folks know who Lothrop Stoddard was? Lothrop Stoddard was a white supremacist who was on the board of Planned Parenthood. When it started, it was called the Birth Control League. And there was a guy named Lothrop Stoddard who was a white supremacist, and he was on the board of Planned Parenthood. And he wrote a book about Nazi Germany. He went to Nazi Germany and he studied their economy. And I will read to you what Lothrop Stoddard wrote about Nazi economics. All right. I'll just pull it up here. All right. Here we go. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry, just trying to find you the quote from Lothrop Stoddard about Nazi economics. Here we go. How did the Nazis actually finance their ambitious projects without currency nor inflation? They did it in a number of ways. Fluid capital was regimented and invested, according to others, or diverted into government loans. Profits were skimmed off by taxation. Above all, and this is the important part, consumption was kept down and living standards were lowered by what was called a process of reverse inflation. The upshot has been that the German people have financed astounding expenditures by literally taking it out of their own hides. That's what Lothrop Stoddard explained. They literally took it out of their own hides. They reduced consumption. When the Nazis came to power in Germany, one of the first things they did was that they threw all the Communist Party leaders in jail and in prison camps. They created a network of prison camps, and they put millions of people into these prison camps. The leaders of the Communist Party and the Communist labor unions were thrown into prison camps, and the leaders of the Social Democratic Party and their labor unions were thrown into prison camps. And a lot of people were hired to be guards at these prison camps. And a lot of people were hired to build these prison camps. And then these prison camps functioned as slave labor for corporations, right? Free, various companies, German companies, steel companies, the car manufacturer, the very famous car manufacturing company that's Volkswagen. They had slave labor to do their jobs for them. Right? And that was a stimulus to various corporations. They got slave labor. Plus, they stimulated the economy, hired a bunch of people to be guards, took all kinds of people who had been in the job market, working, competing for jobs, and threw them in prisons. They weren't looking for jobs anymore. And that drastically reduced unemployment. Then, on top of that, they launched a campaign against women working. And this is a really big thing, is they launched a campaign saying that if women worked outside the home, they were committing a crime, right? And at that point, they urged women, they had a poster of a woman working in a factory, and it said, this woman is taking a job from a good German man who needs to feed his children. And they forced women out of the workforce, right? They shamed women who worked outside of the workforce. And then they increased the marriage bonus. When you got married, the German government gave you like a marriage bonus, like gave you a bunch of money, right? It gave you like a bonus. So they took women out of the workforce. They sent a huge amount of people into prison camps, and they hired a bunch of people to be prison camp guards. And they then used those prison camp folks as free labor for corporations. And those folks became free labor for corporations. And that was a mechanism of stabilizing the economy. But that's degrowth, right? If you take a section of the population and you turn them into slave laborers, that's not increasing consumption, that's reducing consumption. If you take a whole bunch of productive workers out of the workforce, right? You take women out of working, right? You just take a bunch of workers out of the workforce. You make it so women are not working anymore. That's reducing consumption, right? On top of that, they restarted military spending, right? And I talk about this, that Hjalmar Schacht, who was the Nazi economist, there's a great biography of him, and it's called Hitler's Banker, and it talks about this. It talks about it in great detail, right? All right. 1933, Schacht believed in the rearmament of Germany, and so did Adolf Hitler. Schacht always insisted their reasons were differed radically, but in 1933, their thrust was parallel. To prime the manufacturing of armaments and slice away at unemployment, he founded a small shell corporation, strangely named the Metallurgical Research Company, or MIFO. The purpose of MIFO was to finance large government contracts for armaments. Payments were guaranteed by the Reichsbank. Some of the money came from what had been requisitioned by so-called conversion fund. It was ironic that a portion of German rearmament was paid for by foreign money. During the next 4 years, the value of MIFO bonds grew from the original 1 million marks to 12 billion marks. The MIFO bonds became a very desirable investment. He basically created a military-industrial complex as a way of stabilizing the German economy, spending huge amounts of money on weapons, right? And having people loan money to the German government and get paid back. Bankers loan money to the German government to buy weapons and get paid back. And of course, if you're all of a sudden manufacturing weapons like you weren't before, you're going to suddenly have a boom in your economy. Now, another thing that's worth pointing out, and this is, I quote Lyndon LaRouche on this, when he talks about, right, he says, the two principal bases for the Nazi pseudo-recovery of 1933 and 36 were fixing of wages at the lowest depression levels, fixing of wages, and depletion of previously idled constant capital of German industry. Not only were wages reduced, but their real content was further reduced by the exacerbated inflation, while the intensification of exploitation of labor accelerated. By 1936 and 37, the success of Nazi full employment recovery was obviously moving to the point of crisis. In the means of production, the quality of German labor was being depleted by intensification and lower standards of material culture. Simultaneously, Nazi expansion of production was based on massive issuance of fictitious promissory notes. The Reichsbank and other agencies refinanced this cancerously growing mass to cover the growth of debt service obligations beyond the scale of available products for its payment, and was eminently undermined. The Reichsmark faced the prospect of early national bankruptcy. I mean, you look into this, right? And then he talks about, during World War II, the intensification of auto-cannibalism, primitive accumulation, proceeded along the following general lines. The working conditions of forced foreign guest labor were markedly worsened, and the standard of living in the occupied territories generally lowered to prop up the Reichsmark. Depopulation of large sections of Slavic regions occupied by Nazi administration, emulating the salvaging of used tire carcasses by recapping firms as part of slave labor systems. Human bodies were squeezed of their accumulated wealth by slave labor conditions of production, and depleted hulks returned to the SS for replacement parts. As a further measure of capitalist economics, the welfare rolls within the concentration camps were successfully reduced by mass extermination and of the aged women, children, depleted slave labor, and other unemployables. So in essence, Nazi economics is about trying to stabilize capitalism by spending lots of money on weapons and bombs and tanks. That's what Tulsi Gabbard said in her interview. And by utilizing slave labor and creating a slave labor underclass. It's degrowth. It's reducing consumption. That is the essence of Biden-omics. And you'll notice that BlackRock, which is a big corporation, a big British finance company, requires companies to essentially reduce their output in order to get financing, right? In order to get loans, it required Sri Lanka to transition to an organic farming system, right? The private bank, BlackRock, said to Sri Lanka, we will finance you, but you have to stop using pesticides. And so they stopped using pesticides, and their crop output dramatically decreased, right? And there's many examples of this, right? They want to replace, for example, coal power plants with solar panels and windmills. Well, what's the problem with that? Is there something wrong with solar panels? No. Is there something wrong with windmills? No, except they don't produce anywhere near as much electricity. And that essentially Bidenomics is about trying to deal with the problems that I talked about earlier, the problems of overproduction, the tendency of the falling rate of profit. It's trying to deal with all of this stuff by reducing consumption, by driving down the amount of energy that is used, reducing energy, reducing living standards, creating a slave labor underclass, spending lots of money on weapons and militarism. All of this is the essence of Bidenomics. It is the ultra rich, the banks, the financiers like BlackRock, like Goldman Sachs, like Chase Bank, the Rockefellers, the Morgans. They are trying to stabilize capitalism with degrowth methods. That is the essence of Bidenomics, and that is fascism. That's what the Nazis did. And in my new book, I talk about that extensively. That is the essence of Bidenomics. It's fascism. Bidenomics is fascism. And Tulsi Gabbard didn't have time to explain that on the show. And I don't know if she's into all of the depth with which I explain that. But in my book, which I was invited on Kim Iverson's show to talk about, I go into great detail about why Biden-omics or wokeism is fascism. Now, the rallying cry of wokeism is anti-racism. And anti-racism has been around for a really long time, right? The communists were organizing, to support black people, to support the Scottsboro Nine. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a Marxist, was a founder of the NAACP. Black liberation has been in America for a really, really long time. And during the 1960s and 70s, black liberation, you had the Black Panther Party that was, kind of the vanguard of the black liberation struggle. You had various black nationalist groups. There's long been a black liberation movement. But wokeism is very different. Wokeism is privilege politics. Politics that's been fomented at Ivy League universities that basically argues that there is a layer of people in America whose life is too good. Right? There's a layer of people in America who are too comfortable. There's that middle class of America. Their life is too good. They're privileged, and they need to have their privilege taken away. The word privilege is not a good word. Why is the word privilege not a good word? Because a privilege is something that you are not entitled to. And this is really important. A privilege is something you're not entitled to, right? If let me put it this way, the things that black people face are violations of their rights. Racism and the things that black people face for being black are not them not having privileges. These are violations of their rights. If someone applies for a job and doesn't get it on the basis of their race, they're denied employment, and they face discrimination in employment on the basis of their race, this is called a violation of their rights. You have the right to not be discriminated against. If a police officer shoots you for reaching for your wallet, that is not because you didn't have a privilege. That is a violation of your rights. Right? If you live in conditions that are worse, if you lack opportunity on account of your race, that is a violation of your rights. And racism is a violation of the rights of black people. Black people should have equal rights in U.S. society, equal rights to employment, equal rights to treatment, and equal treatment in the courts, but they don't. We know that. There is systemic racism in America. And that is the violation of black people's rights. However, the way wokeism talks about is it says, no. It's not that black people have their rights violated. Rather, wokeism says that white people have white privilege. And so what is the logical conclusion of this? Right? If one group has an unfair privilege, and that is the basis of systemic racism. Not that there is routine violation of the rights of one group, but rather that another group has an unfair privilege. What is the logical conclusion? Obviously, we need to just take this group's unfair privilege away. So essentially, rather than correcting the violation of the rights of black people, we need to bring the white working class down. That is what wokeism argues. And that is essentially what they argue. I mean, they argue that working class white people, because they don't suffer the injustices that black people suffer, which they don't, that instead of raising up the black community, we should focus on shaming, tearing down, and opposing the higher living standards that white workers once enjoyed. And the reality is that, that white working class, that white middle class that used to exist, I mean, it's largely gone. I mean, the prosperous industrial centers of the country are largely gone. Now, deindustrialization did hit the black community first, right? Detroit got shut down way, way before, the jobs elsewhere. But deindustrialization has already driven down living standards across the United States. Right. And the black community suffered more than anybody. They were the first targets, right? The deindustrialization of the urban centers came before deindustrialization elsewhere. They shut down the jobs in Detroit and the plants in Detroit and the jobs in urban areas before they shut them down in rural areas. This is a fact, right? The predatory lending crisis hit the black community before it hit the white community. Mass incarceration and criminalization had obviously come down a lot harder on the black community than on white workers. And we saw what happened in New Orleans. After the Hurricane Katrina, they went into New Orleans and implemented austerity and degrowth policies drastically, and they got rid of public housing. So the agenda of the rich is to drive down everyone's living standards: white, black, Arab, Asian, Latino. They want to impoverish and reduce consumption on the part of the whole population in order to stabilize their system. They're trying to save capitalism with degrowth. That's the nature of fascism. However, wokeism weaponizes the anger at historic injustices to polarize U.S. society. And that's essentially what's going on, is that they are using the belief that middle America is racist, that middle Americans have white privilege, that the anger at January 6th wasn't motivated by their economic suffering. They're just losing their privilege. That's what was said by Rashida Tlaib, right? Is that the middle America, that they're rioting on January 6th because they're losing their privilege, right? This is the essence of wokeism. Wokeism is about implementing policies of degrowth, reducing energy consumption. The Green New Deal is all about reducing the amount of electricity that the population uses, right? Reducing living standards, reducing consumption, making it harder for people to buy things, having people live on less and less and less. This is that whole thing from Klaus Schwab about you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. This is what they're talking about, right? This is fascist Biden-omics. It is an attempt to save capitalism with degrowth methods. And this is complicated stuff, and this isn't stuff that you can answer with a slogan. But the ultra-rich, in order to stay in power, are trying to carry out degrowth economics and reduce consumption and reduce the population and create a slave labor underclass. They're trying to reduce the population and reduce consumption as a way of stabilizing capitalism. And they are using the government to do it. And the reason that I'm very happy that Tulsi Gabbard didn't call it communism is because communism is inherently the opposite of this. Fascism is about keeping capitalism and production organized for profit, but trying to save it by forcibly degrowing. And if you want to read a really good book that explains this was written during the Great Depression. It's called Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt. I'll drop the link in the chat. The whole text, the whole book is online if you want to read it. R. Palm Dutt, the British Marxist, he goes into great detail about the economic nature of fascism, right? Go read R. Palm Dutt. He explains it in great depth. And I quote R. Palm Dutt in my new book as well, Where is America Going? Right? That they are trying to save capitalism. They're trying to save the capitalist system with degrowth. And that is the nature of fascism. And this is something Peter Coffin has talked about in his great documentaries about how overpopulation is bullshit. He made a great documentary film that Peter Coffin made called Less Sucks. It was a really a great documentary film. I really think people should check it out. And that's the essence of fascist economics. But communism is something completely different. Communism is society taking control of the means of production. The banks and the factories and the industries and the centers of economic power being seized by the working class, by society. And communism then enables growth to continue, no longer restrained by the irrationality of capitalism. Communism says that the capitalist is constantly trying to hire fewer and fewer workers to work at the assembly line. Less and less workers are hired. This leads to this problem of overproduction. And as the worker is outcast and starving, right, the masses of workers, the reserve army of labor, the unemployed, the hungry, the desperately poor, the precariat, right, the increasingly almost semi-permanently unemployed class, the increasingly unemployed, the hungry, the desperate, the working class will band together and take control of the means of production. The banks and the factories and the major industries and the centers of economic power will be seized by the working class. And then they will be operated on a rational central plan so that growth can expand. Communism is all about growth. If you look at the Soviet Union, they were dirt poor. They almost had nothing when the Bolsheviks came to power. By the mid-1930s, they had built the world's largest hydroelectric power plant. They had industrialized the whole place. They'd wiped out illiteracy. You look at China. China used to be the sick man of Asia. Now it's the second largest economy in the world. 800 million people lifted out of poverty. In communist countries, the government has a 5-year economic plan where they plan out how they can increase production. And they organize production according to a central plan, and they raise productivity, and they raise living standards. I've pointed out that in a rational socialist society, self-driving cars would be great because there's less work for everyone to do. All the human labor expended on driving can be expended elsewhere to create more wealth because human labor is no longer necessary for driving. Under capitalism, self-driving cars leads to mass hunger and unemployment because workers who, truck drivers, cab drivers, people who work in traffic courts, all of them are out of a job. But in a socialist society, self-driving cars lead to an even wealthier society because human labor no longer has to be expended on driving. It can be expended elsewhere because it's a rationally planned economy. Socialism is putting rational human planning in control of the means of production in order to increase productivity and raise countries up. That is the nature of socialism. Socialism is overcoming the irrationality of capitalism so that growth is no longer restrained by the irrationality of the market. That is what socialism is. And socialism has nothing to do with Biden-omics and degrowth, right? It has nothing to do with that. Socialism is all about growth. It's about expanding living standards. It's about increasing consumption, increasing the level of productivity and wealth in society. That is the nature of socialism. Socialist countries are obsessed with creating wealth. And you talk about Vietnam's economic miracle. Lots been written about that. You talk about China and their amazing expansion, poverty alleviation, world's largest hydroelectric power plant, world's largest telecommunications manufacturer. So many people have become millionaires and billionaires in China as living standards have increased. Socialism is not about making everyone poor and equal. Socialism is rather about organizing the economy so growth is no longer restrained by the irrationality of the market. And that is what's very important. Fascism is degrowth. The nature of fascism is degrowth. Whereas the nature of socialism is central planning and the lifting of artificial restraints on growth. And the goal is a society with so much wealth that all inequality can fade away, from each according to his own ability to each according to his needs. That's the goal of socialism, to build a society with so much wealth and so much abundance that the need for a government can go away, from each according to his own ability to each according to his needs. That is the goal of socialism, to create a society with so much wealth and abundance that there's no inequality between people. People can just take what they need and do what they feel like doing. Labor becomes life's prime want and no longer a necessity, meaning people work because they feel like it, to entertain themselves, not out of necessity. And the government fades away and inequality fades away, and people are completely triumphing over nature, right? That the enslaving of human beings to nature is eliminated. This is Marxism, what I'm explaining here, right? This is Marxist economics, is the understanding that the irrationality of capitalism leads to this increased problem of the tendency of the falling rate of profit. And that's Marxism. Now, we at the Center for Political Innovation, we have put forward a 4-point economic plan that would rescue the country from the crisis of capitalism that it's currently facing. Step 1 would be a mass mobilization to rebuild America, to rebuild the roads and the bridges, to build high-speed railway, to build new schools and universities, to just completely revamp the country, hire millions of unemployed people to go out and rebuild America. America is falling apart. While we spend money on bombs and tanks and weapons in other countries, hire millions of unemployed people and put them to work rebuilding America. That's the first step. Second step, how are you going to pay for it? Put natural gas, oil, coal, timber, all of America's natural resources, all the wealth produced by the soil of this country should be public property. And the wealth created by America's natural resources should go into the public budget. No more should oil companies get rich off the oil underneath the ground. No more should natural gas companies be getting rich off of fracking underneath your home. All the natural wealth of America should be used to make America a wealthier country. Public ownership of our natural resources. The third step would be public control of the lending of money. Let credit, finance, the lending of money be done by the state, right? At a state level, at a federal level, at a local level, have local banks that don't operate for profit, state banks, and a national bank that doesn't operate for profit, lending money strategically in accordance with an overall economic vision to improve the country. We decide that America needs more of a certain type of business, the banks will lend money to people to start those types of businesses. We decide we want to increase home ownership, the banks will lend money to people to go buy their own homes, right? It's about central control of the purse strings of credit. And of course, that would include abolishing the private corporation called the Federal Reserve Bank and having the federal government handle and print money as it says in the U.S. Constitution. That would include eliminating credit card companies, eliminating basically putting Wall Street out of business, and having the state become the central creditor, a state central bank, abolishing private lending of money. That would be the third step. And the fourth step would then be enacting an economic bill of rights, hiring everyone, declaring people have the right to a job, declaring that people have right to an education, declaring that people have the right to health care. And really, that would be an investment in the population. The way we've been trained to think about things, like a job guarantee, like free college, like free health care, we've been trained to think of these things as a handout, about as like a gift that society is giving to people. No. If you have a population in your country full of people, those folks should be contributing to the economy because human labor is the source of all wealth. So why would you not want to have every person who is able-bodied working in your country, right? So you would obviously want to make sure there was a jobs guarantee so that human labor was being productive and creating wealth. And would you not want the people of your country to be educated, to have the skills they need to do the jobs, to be able to invent things, to be able to make good decisions when they go to vote at the ballot box? So providing education to your population is investing in your population. And of course, if your population is productive. You want them to go be productive. They got to be healthy, right? If they're sick all the time, that's not good either. So you want to invest in having proper health care for your population. And an economic bill of rights is not a handout. It's not a welfare program. It is an investment in the future of the country. So enacting an economic bill of rights would enable productive labor in society to increase. It would enable the population to get smarter. It would enable the population to be healthier and therefore more productive. And we'd be mobilizing the country to rebuild economically. We'd be strategically lending money and assigning credit based on the national interest of the country and an overall economic plan. We would have control over all the wealth created by our natural resources. This would be the first step toward a socialist economy in the United States. Now, that in and of itself, in theory, one could imagine a Norwegian welfare state that did all of these things and wasn't socialism. But in order to beat back the power of all the oil companies and all the banks, in order to mobilize the population and have a government that hired the unemployed and could enact an economic bill of rights, you would have to defeat so much capitalist power. The richest of the rich, the oil bankers, would be defeated. Silicon Valley and the tech monopolies would be defeated. At that point, socialism wouldn't be that far off. And that this 4-point economic plan is in the interests, not just of the working class. The working class would benefit the most from this, with their economic bill of rights, full employment, rebuilding their communities. But it would also be in the interest of the small business owner. The small business owner wants to have decent roads so people can drive to his business, and drive to his store and buy things. The small business owner wants to have credit assigned to his community so that they can open more small businesses and expand their business operations. The small business owner wants the people in his community to be employed so they can go to his store and buy his products. And the lower levels of capital would benefit from this economic program. The whole nature of the 4-point plan of the Center for Political Innovation is to defeat the power of the ultra monopolists, of the imperialists. That is the nature of our 4-point economic plan. It targets the oil bankers, the oil monopolists, the natural resources owners, the big corporations. It targets them and it mobilizes the population. And this is a program that could secure the victory of an anti-monopoly coalition. Right? If you read what the Communist Party of the United States historically advocated during the Cold War and elsewhere, they understood that they were not fighting against all capitalism. But in our age, we're fighting against imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. We're fighting against the rule of the world by big corporations and banks based in Western countries that are holding back development and restraining human creativity and human productivity. Human beings and our wealth and our brilliance, our ability to create, is being restrained by the irrationality of greed and the domination of the global markets by these big corporations. So the big corporations, the ultra monopolies, must be defeated. And in order to do so, we want the working class to align with the small business owner, to align with the farmers, to align with even the lower levels of capital on the basis of rebuilding the economy. The ultra rich and the monopolies are pushing fascism, degrowth economics to save capitalism. The lower levels of capital are in revolt against degrowth because they want to maintain their profits. The working class is also in revolt because it doesn't want to be degrown. It doesn't want to be depopulated. It doesn't want to be impoverished. It doesn't want to be pushed into nothing. There's millions and millions of the overwhelming bulk of U.S. society is suffering right now and is facing a forced degrowth at the hands of the ultra monopolies. So the natural response to this crisis is to build an anti-monopoly coalition to reject fascist economics and degrowth, to connect the United States economically with the center of growth in the world right now, which is China and Russia and the Eurasian explosion, the new alternative economy, the BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Belt and Road. You look at what's happening. I mean, right now in Russia, they're having a China-Russia forum, and they're talking about all the great investment, I mean, it's amazing what Russia is doing in Africa right now, and China is right there with them. and that there's a huge opportunity for growth in this world if the United States could attach itself to this new emerging economy. All of this lays the basis for a real coalition to be created, an anti-monopoly coalition.